I know this isn't exactly a show known for its subtlety, but what in the ever-loving hell? I am General Obstinate Bureaucrat. Right? I mean, I've talked about that character archetype so many times. And I will ensure that everything goes as badly as possible, and you will do exactly as I say at all times. What? It's funny because it's Lee. It's like, yeah, Lee, you're back. You're awesome. You're terrible. God, you're the worst. Why are you here, Lee? Go away, Lee. I mean, granted, I know where this is going, but at the time, all I remember thinking when going through this episode for the first time was, damn, they're laying it on a little thick, aren't they? I also have to admit, and this is going to sound really stupid, but this is not the first time that I've looked at, a clone dying and was basically like, no, like legitimate tension. No, don't die. And they died. Because obviously none of the main characters can die. We know where that's going. But basically all of the clones could die. Anyways. So General Krell, excuse me. General Lee, wow. Is actually a clonist. And he's not exactly the only one who's clonist. In fact, I know someone personally who's clonist. You know who you are if you're watching this. And you're a horrible human being. And I want to relate something to that, though. Because, again, obviously Krell is doing something specifically here, and we'll talk about that in future episodes. But in this episode, you could get away with the impression that he is an RTS player. Let me explain what I mean by that. I have been accused many times of not being that good at strategy games, and it's a valid complaint, because I don't think of them as strategy games. Now, I know that sounds strange, but to explain what I mean by that, if I'm playing StarCraft 2, and I win the match by killing all my troops and wiping out my own production lines, then I've won the match. That's playing an RTS. And I am bad at that. I am legitimately bad at that, and that's one of the reasons why I've never been high tier at any of those particular kind of tactical strategy games. I tend to think of it more in the sense of, well, the role player's perspective, to be blunt. I want as many of my people to live as possible, and I want as much of my infrastructure to be functional as possible. Now, I can break out of that mindset for particularly difficult missions and have, but that's generally where my thoughts are at. Whoa, dark. Suddenly it's nighttime. But the point being that Krell strikes me as someone who is leading his men and as if he's playing a game. And thus, in the game, nothing matters other than victory. Whatever you have to do to get to that victory point doesn't matter because it's irrelevant. And you could say, well, that's horrible for an actual commander of actual people to have, but he's not a commander of actual people, he's a commander of clones. Now, granted, I think clones are people because I have a functioning brain. But Krell, of course, thinks of them as if they are units to be expended, as if it's a video game. There's no consequence for Marine 37 to die, right? And the same way for him. That being said, I almost find it funny how he goes out of his way to memorize their numbers rather than their names, just to speak down to them. I mean, even the dog doesn't like that. And part of the reason I find that so funny is because that's got to be more effort and work. So he's going out of his way to push them down. It's almost kind of dark-sidey, isn't it? It's a shame, too, that, I mean, obviously I've kind of given this away already, but, he's a bad guy, spoilers, because it would be interesting to see if he really was a by-the-books leader. He's not. He's an idiot, as I already mentioned. He's a ends justifies the means kind of a leader. But I mention that because it would have been an interesting contrast to Anakin's style. Having a truly by-the-books, organizational, we must do things in this exact manner kind of a leader, versus Anakin, who just kind of goes with it and is very adaptable in his approach. Anakin also tends to lead from the front. Now, this is interesting because in almost every other fictional setting, and real life, having your general and the front lines is not a good idea. But in the case of the Jedi, they kind of bypass that usual problem because that's exactly where they should be. In fact, to be frank, most of the Jedi are so actively bad at strategy that they should probably be units rather than leaders. But we've talked about that before. Two quick things I want to talk about really quick before we move on. First of all, forced marching is a mess. I'm actually happy that this episode called out the fact that he was forcing the clones into a forced march situation, because forced marching is a mess. I'm not even going to go into it in detail because this isn't a full rumination, and, well, to be perfectly blunt, I haven't done a forced march myself since I was a kid, so, not a lot of personal experience with that one, but, yeah, Attrition is definitely going to be a problem when you force march your units. Holy crap. We need to go get this thing, and we need to win now. That means I want my men in the worst possible fighting condition when we get there. It's like, okay. The funny thing is, I bet you if Anakin asked them to force march, they would have gone along with it. Which is the second point I wanted to bring up. Following orders is obviously a thing. I've talked about following orders and the, well, let's call it the strange philosophical issues around following orders and what you should do for following orders and what you shouldn't do and blah, 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 blah. Because in a combat situation, it's generally accepted military doctrine that you follow orders like that. Because in the heat of a battle, you are supposed to have enough trust in your commander that they know the situation better than you do. And thus, the commander says, jump, and even though there's a bunch of razor wire above you, you jump. Terrible analogy, but you get the point. But that trust has to be earned. Again, I guarantee you, Anakin said, jump! They would do so like that, without hesitation. But Krell has none of that trust, and in fact is actively going out of his way to antagonize his own troops, as I mentioned earlier. Which leads to the opposite problem. We'll talk more about following orders and the significance of that in the future episodes, so I will see you guys next time.